I was 74 years old the night my son drugged me. The memory is burned into my body as much as my mind, not in one sudden strike, but in 1,000 quiet details that turned out to be warning signs I ignored. The last thing I remember clearly before the darkness took me was Julian's hand resting gently on my shoulder, his voice close enough that his breath warmed my ear. "Just rest, Mom. I'll take care of everything." Those words, soft as a lullaby, should have been a comfort. Instead, when I woke hours later, they became the most chilling sentence of my life. The house was silent, my old coastal Maine home wrapped in the stillness before dawn. But inside me, alarms were ringing. My tongue felt heavy, my limbs sluggish, my mind fogged as though I'd sunk underwater. That was when it struck me, the tea. The chamomile he'd insisted I drink, the faint bitter note I had dismissed as age or fatigue, had been something else entirely. In those 12 minutes between the warmth of the cup in my hands and the weight dragging me into oblivion, my son had dismantled 40 years of my life. The first confirmation came in the form of frantic vibrations on my nightstand. My phone buzzed against the polished oak with a rhythm that felt almost frantic, a digital heartbeat hammering in the quiet house. My arthritic hands fumbled for it, my breath catching when the screen lit up with a cascade of notifications. Casco Bay Mutual Bank. Transfer initiated. Transfer completed. Again and again, like the strikes of a relentless bell. Each message carried a number, and the numbers grew larger, crueler. 50,000, 85,000, 90. By the final alert, the figure glowed unforgivingly at me, $317,000. Every cent that Robert and I had saved since our 20s. That money was not just numbers. It was a life. It was the promise Robert made to me before cancer hollowed him out, the quiet assurance that after he was gone, I would never be left vulnerable. It was decades of patched-up cars, of second-hand clothes, of vacations skipped, so we could make another mortgage payment. It was his hands rough from carpentry jobs he took on weekends pressing mine and saying, "You won't have to worry, Ellie, I swear." And Julian knew it. He knew what that sum represented, because I had told him the story of its every sacrifice. Yet he took it anyway. The memory of the previous evening clawed back in cruel fragments. Julian had arrived just before sunset, the horizon over the pines streaked with bruised purple and blood orange. His energy was feverish, words spilling as he spoke about a new venture. A startup, he said, that would revolutionize online commerce. I had heard this performance before 6 times, with different names, different partners, all ending in silence. But I listened, as mothers do, my hands folded in my lap as he paced across the rug, gesturing wildly, spinning dreams out of air. What unsettled me even then, though I did not name it, was how attentive he seemed. He noticed the draft and fussed with the window. He tucked a quilt over my knees. He insisted I needed tea, dismissing my usual Earl Grey. "Something to help you relax, Mom?" he said, smiling so warmly it seemed to cast its own light. He returned from the kitchen with a steaming mug. Chamomile, he told me, but there was something else under the floral scent, something sharper. Medicinal. I had taken a sip anyway, too weary to argue. As I swallowed, he asked questions casual on the surface, but strangely pointed. Did I still use the same password for most of my accounts? Did the bank ever call me for big transfers? Where did I keep Robert's old papers? I answered distractedly, chalking my drowsiness up to a long day, volunteering at the library. My eyelids grew heavy. My thoughts blurred. He touched my shoulder gently, his voice soothing. "You look tired, Mom. Go on up to bed. I'll lock up." That was the last moment I remembered with clarity before the abyss. Now, in the gray light of dawn, the truth lay bare. The creaks in the floorboards I'd half heard were not the house settling. The faint glow beneath my door was not a dream. They had been Julian moving through my office, his face illuminated by the blue glare of my laptop screen as he stole what was never his. For 30 years, I had been the town archivist. My life was order records, preservation of truth. I was the one who documented what others wished forgotten. The bitter irony now was unmistakable. I had safeguarded the stories of strangers, yet my own story was being dismantled by my son. But I was not powerless. An archivist knows that the most devastating truths are not shouted. They are written, stored, preserved until they cannot be denied. If Julian thought he had destroyed me, he had miscalculated. I would document everything. I rose slowly, every joint aching, and began to move through the house, not as its inhabitant, but as its investigator. The teacup still sat on the counter, faint residue clinging to its rim. I sealed it carefully in a plastic bag and placed it in the freezer. In my office, the chair was left at a strange angle. My laptop, usually left open, was closed. I did not touch it. I photographed it instead, noting the time in a small black notebook that would become my ledger of betrayal. By midday, I called my oldest friend Beatrice, a retired nurse with eyes as sharp as the Maine tide. "Something has happened with my finances," I said evenly. "I need you to be my witness." She was at my door within the hour, her face lined with concern, but steady with resolve. I laid out the notifications, the teacup, the memories. She did not gasp or offer platitudes. She only asked, "What did the tea smell like?" When I told her, she nodded grimly. Together, we began building the foundation of a case. Beatrice remembered Julian mentioning a doctor across the bay, a holistic practitioner. She made a few quiet calls. The man specialized in herbal sedatives, including a powerful valerian root blend. The pieces clicked together. Later that afternoon, she summoned her cousin Alistair Finch, a semi-retired corporate lawyer, who carried the weight of decades in his voice. He listened, flipping through the evidence with slow, deliberate care. At last, he looked at me. "The bank will call this authorized," he said, voice low. "It came from your device. They'll assume scam or senility. Our task is to prove otherwise. Intent, opportunity. And we must do it without tipping him off. Let him think you're still asleep." Those words settled into me like stone. Let him think I was asleep. Yes, that would be my strength. He had underestimated me, blinded by the caricature of frailty. He would learn soon enough what truth in the hands of an archivist could do. In the days that followed, I lived a strange double life. To Julian, I was the same old woman he thought he had outsmarted, distracted, tired, grateful for his attention. To myself, and the few people I trusted, I was an archivist turned investigator, quietly assembling a case, brick by brick. Each time the phone rang, and Julian's voice spilled out syrupy with concern, I played my part. "I've been so tired lately," I murmured, letting my words trail off, as though my mind was fraying. On the other end of the line, he would chuckle softly, assured that I was adrift in the fog he had created. He thought he had weakened me. He thought the sedative had left me confused. What he never realized was that his deception had awakened something sharper inside me than I had felt in years. My notebook grew thick with observations. The photographs of my laptop, the sealed teacup, the time-stamped bank alerts, all of it went into my ledger of betrayal. Beatrice came every afternoon, bringing her no-nonsense steadiness, her pen scratching beside mine as she added details I might have missed. "You always used to say truth survives because someone writes it down," she reminded me once. "So write it down. Every word, every sign." Alistair, with his calm gravitas, moved us into the next phase. He brought in Mr. Davies, a young technician whose fingers flew over my laptop keys with surgical precision. Hours later, His face tightened as he pushed back from the desk. A keylogger, he told us, installed 2 weeks ago during another of his visits. It's been capturing every keystroke, your passwords, your answers to security questions, everything. He paused, lowering his voice. But the transfers themselves weren't remote. He sat right here at 2 a.m. and used your own machine. I stared at my desk, the one I had sat at for 30 years, cataloging town records, building order from chaos. Now it was contaminated. My sanctuary turned into a crime scene. The thought of Julian sitting there in the dark, watching the screen glow as he dismantled my life, pressed on me with a weight I could hardly bear. Still, we pressed on. Alistair hired a private investigator, a retired state trooper named Miller, whose presence was so unremarkable he could have disappeared into wallpaper. Within days, his reports trickled in, each one more damning than the last. Julian's startup was not a budding empire, but a smokescreen. He owed staggering sums to a Boston lender whose collection methods were whispered about with fear. The money he had stolen from me had not been invested. It had gone straight into the gaping maw of his debts, buying him only temporary reprieve. Reading those reports was like swallowing glass. He hadn't stolen in pursuit of a dream. He had stolen to stave off his own ruin. He had chosen to let me bear the collapse in his place. The calls kept coming. His tone was so carefully measured, full of counterfeit tenderness. "Are you sleeping all right, Mom? Are you eating enough?" I answered with the softness he expected, even letting my voice tremble sometimes. Each lie I told him was another stitch in the net closing around him. I wondered if he could hear the disgust beneath my feigned gratitude, but he seemed oblivious. He thought the performance was perfect. Then one morning he suggested lunch. "Just us," he said too brightly. "It's been a while." When I relayed this to Alistair, his advice was immediate. "Go. Let him speak. Say nothing of substance. Listen." The clam shack was noisy with the clatter of dishes and the smell of salt and grease. Julian arrived jittery, scanning the room as if hunted. He launched into his usual performance, talking about the business, about an investor just about to sign. Then, as if casually, he turned to me. "You know, Mom, you really should let me help manage your money. All that just sitting in the bank, it's not safe these days." I looked at him, my son, with his carefully rehearsed sincerity, and felt something colder than rage. Pity. He was not a mastermind. He was a desperate man, flailing in water too deep for him, clinging to anything he could grasp, even his own mother. I smiled. "That's sweet of you to offer, dear. But your father set everything up perfectly. It takes care of itself." For a flicker of a second, frustration cracked his mask. His jaw tightened, his eyes sharp with irritation. But then the smile returned, stretched thin. He thought he was still in control. He had no idea that the ground beneath him was already crumbling. A week later, Alistair called with the final piece of intelligence. His voice was steady, but I could feel the gravity beneath it. "He's booked a one-way flight to the Caymans. 3 days from now. It's time." That morning, the world was wrapped in fog, the kind that muffles sound and erases distance. I moved through the house as though in a dream, touching Robert's books, pausing before the photograph of Julian as a child, freckles across his nose, beaming on the deck of our old sailboat. My heart clenched with memory, with grief. Where had that boy gone? When had his light hardened into hunger? But sentiment could wait. The trap had to spring. Alistair met with the bank's fraud director, presenting not just accusations, but a case as airtight as glass. Forensic reports, keylogger data, financial timelines, sworn statements. He did not frame it as a confused old woman duped by her son. He framed it as premeditated, calculated theft, executed with digital sophistication. The director listened in silence, and when the presentation ended, nodded once. action would be taken immediately. That same morning, Alistair's legal team filed an emergency injunction with the Superior Court, requesting a freeze on all of Julian's accounts. The evidence was overwhelming, and with his flight risk established, the order came swiftly. By late afternoon, the net had closed. Julian's accounts were frozen, his escape plan severed. The phone rang at 3 o'clock. His voice on the other end was unrecognizable, ragged with panic. "What did you do?" he shouted. "My accounts, they're frozen. I can't." He broke off his breath, ragged. "I can't even buy coffee." "What did you do, Mom?" I held the phone steady, the receiver cool against my cheek. My voice was calm, almost gentle. "I did what your father would have expected me to do, Julian. I took care of everything." For a moment, there was only the sound of his ragged breathing. Then, a strangled sob, the sound of a cornered animal, and the line went dead. I placed the receiver back in its cradle and turned toward the window. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift. The jagged rocks of the shoreline emerged sharp and unforgiving, just as the truth had emerged. The confrontation was not over, but the balance had shifted. Julian had thought my love was weakness. He had never understood that love could also be steel. The freeze on Julian's accounts shifted everything. What had been whispers and suspicions solidified into power. The silence from him lasted 2 days, and then word came through his lawyer, a man from Boston with a polished smile and cufflinks that gleamed under every light. He requested a meeting. Alistair chose the location his office a space lined with old leather chairs and shelves of books whose spines had been cracked by decades of law. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked steadily, a reminder that time was not Julian's ally. When we arrived, I sat across from my son for the first time since that morning when the world had tilted. Julian looked smaller. His skin was pale, stretched over sharp cheekbones, his hair unkempt. He avoided my eyes, staring instead at the far wall, his hands clenched together so tightly the knuckles were white. It hurt to see him like that, but I would not look away. I needed to see what he had become. His lawyer began with smooth, rehearsed words. He spoke of settlements of compromise. They would return a portion of the money if I dropped the charges. Surely, he said, his tone practiced the family would prefer not to drag this through court. It could get messy. He let the word hang, hoping I would flinch. He spoke of dignity, of sparing reputations. He tried to cloak theft in the language of mercy. I sat silent. My gaze never left Julian's bowed head. Let them mistake my stillness for indecision. Alistair beside me leaned forward with the patience of a man sharpening a blade. "No," he said, just that single word delivered with such weight that it silenced the room. Then he pulled a folder from his briefcase and slid it across the table. "This," he said, "is not negotiation. These are the terms." Inside the folder was not compromise, but surrender. The full sum was to be returned every dollar plus interest and all legal fees. Julian would sign a binding agreement relinquishing any and all claims to my estate, present and future. And there was one final condition, a signed confession. A detailed account of his actions notarized and sealed, held in escrow by Alistair. That confession would remain sealed only as long as Julian abided by the terms, attending treatment for his gambling addiction, making every payment, refraining from contacting me without legal consent. Any violation and the confession would go directly to the district attorney's office. The lawyer bristled, flipping through the pages, sputtering about fairness, about harshness. But Alistair didn't waver. He repeated only once, "These are the terms." At last, Julian lifted his head. His eyes met mine for the first time in weeks. In them, I searched for something, remorse, recognition, even anger. What I saw was emptiness. Not the wild defiance of a man who still thought he could win, not the shame of a son realizing what he had done. Just defeat. Hollow and gray. His lips moved, but no words came. Then he gave a jerky nod, the kind a man makes when all strength has drained away. Walking out of that office, the crisp autumn air cutting against my cheeks, I felt no victory. What triumph is there in watching your child unravel? The law was on my side, the money would return, but nothing could restore the fabric of family that had been torn apart. I remembered Julian at 10 years old, freckles across his nose, grinning as he showed me a lopsided model boat. I remembered him at 16, slamming doors after heartbreak. I remembered him at 20, bright-eyed, convinced the world owed him greatness. How had those moments dissolved into this? At what crossroad had he chosen greed over love? The months that followed were slow and deliberate. The money returned in stages, each transfer marked by a sterile notification. I watched the numbers rise back in my account, but they didn't feel the same. The sum was intact, but its spirit had changed. It no longer carried only Robert's promise. It carried my endurance. It was no longer a safety net. It was evidence that I had survived. Julian's compliance was monitored through his lawyer. Reports came he had entered the treatment program he was attending. He was paying installments. The updates were cold, clinical, stripped of emotion. I read them with detachment, refusing to let my heart invest in them. I had no contact with him. Not a letter, not a call. The silence stretched between us, heavy, unyielding. And yet at night, when the house was quiet and the garden outside my new cottage lay in shadow, memories stole back. Julian as a child, his small hand in mine. His laughter ringing out across the water when Robert lifted him onto the sailboat mast. His face in candlelight on his 21st birthday, hope glowing brighter than the flame itself. Those images haunted me not because I wanted him back, but because I could not understand how the boy in those memories had become the man in Alistair's office. There was one more encounter. Months after the settlement, I saw him by chance outside the courthouse. He looked thinner, his movements jerky, his hair threaded with gray. He spotted me. For a moment, our eyes locked. The world seemed to stop. 1,000 unsaid words crowded the space between us. His mouth opened, but I turned away before sound could pass his lips. There was nothing left to say. Back home, I opened the ledger one last time. Page after page bore the record of betrayal, discovery, evidence, and resolution. I traced the ink with my finger, remembering the fear and fury that had guided my hand as I wrote. Then I closed the notebook and placed it in a drawer. The archivist in me had completed her work. The mother in me would carry her scar forever. The world outside my window was shifting too. The community garden was alive with voices, children laughing, neighbors chatting over rows of beans and roses. Life moved forward whether I was ready or not. And so step by step, I tried to follow. Winter settled in quietly, like a blanket pulled over a restless body. After the storm of Julian's betrayal and the long months of legal maneuvers, the silence felt almost foreign. The sea outside my window no longer sounded like a threat. Its rhythm, steady and unchanging, seemed to echo the truth I had finally accepted. Life does not stop for grief. It carries on wave after wave, asking us to decide whether we will sink or swim. I sold the old sea captain's house. Its bones were sturdy, its walls strong, but every corner had been tainted. The floorboards that once sang with Robert's footsteps now carried only the memory of Julian's quiet thefts. The study where I had cataloged town histories for 3 decades was no longer a sanctuary. It was the crime scene where my son had sat in the glow of my laptop, siphoning away the life Robert and I had built. I walked through each room one last time, my fingers brushing the spines of books, the cool glass of framed photographs, the worn banister smoothed by years of hands. When I locked the door for the final time, I did not cry. I had already shed all my tears. The cottage I bought in town was smaller, brighter, and overlooked the community garden. Children chased each other between rows of beans and lavender. Neighbors waved across fences. The air smelled of earth and new beginnings. It was not haunted by ghosts. It gave me space to breathe again. When the money returned to my account in full, it no longer felt like the same sum that Robert had promised would keep me safe. It carried new weight now, not only his love, but my endurance. It was proof that I had survived betrayal and refused to collapse. I knew I could not let it sit untouched, as though it were only a reminder of what Julian had tried to take. Money should be used, not feared. So I created the Vance Grant, named after Robert. The foundation began small financial literacy classes for seniors at the library pamphlets on how to recognize fraud workshops about digital security. From there, it grew into a program that also supported families navigating the wreckage of addiction. I sat in church basements listening to strangers tell stories of sons and daughters who had stolen from them, of parents who had lost homes, of siblings who no longer spoke. Their voices were raw, with the same grief that had once hollowed me, and every time I told them they were not alone. That survival was possible. That strength did not mean rage or vengeance, but clarity and resolve. The faces I met through that work carried me through the quiet nights when memories crept back. Julian as a boy, freckles bright under the summer sun. Julian at 20, his eyes blazing with dreams of success. Julian as a man, his head bowed in Alistair's office, emptied of hope. These images would never leave me. They lived in me like scars under the skin, hidden from view, but sensitive to every touch. People sometimes ask if I forgave him. The truth is complicated. Forgiveness is not a gift one person bestows on another like coins dropped in a jar. It is a bridge built plank by plank from both sides. Julian never came to that bridge. He never asked for forgiveness, never reached out in true repentance. I could not build the structure alone. So forgiveness remains unfinished, suspended in the air, a bridge to nowhere. And yet, I do not hate him. Hatred is too heavy a burden to carry. What I feel is something quieter, sadder, mourning for a boy who once laughed on a sailboat, whose hand once clutched mine with unshakable trust. That boy is gone. The man who replaced him is someone I no longer know. 1 year after the settlement, I saw him one last time. It was a cold day, the sky flat and gray, as I left the courthouse after a foundation board meeting. Across the street, Julian stood thinner than before, his hair streaked with silver. He didn't see me at first. When he finally did, his eyes widened, and for a moment the world seemed to still. Our gazes met, and I thought I saw the ghost of that boy again, flickering through the exhaustion in his face. His mouth opened, as if words might come. I turned away before they did. There was nothing left to say. That evening, I lit a lamp and sat by the cottage window, watching the lanterns flicker in the community garden. The air smelled of rosemary and soil. In the drawer of my desk lay the ledger I had filled in those first frantic days after the theft, photographs, notes, timestamps, affidavits. The story of his betrayal preserved in ink. I opened it, flipped through the pages one last time, and then closed it gently. The archivist in me had finished her work. The mother in me carried her wound, but it no longer bled. I have come to believe that strength is not the roar of vengeance, nor the blaze of anger. True strength is quieter. It is the decision to protect what you have built, even when those you love try to destroy it. It is the choice to stand tall when the world expects you to collapse. It is the refusal to let betrayal be the final word in your story. Wounds may never fully heal, but they can be repurposed into something that honors both the pain and the perseverance. That is what I did. I refused to let Julian's actions define me. I chose instead to transform his theft into a lifeline for others. And in doing so, I found that while love may be shattered, it can still leave behind the steel of resilience. If you have listened to my story and felt something stir inside you, whether recognition, sorrow, or strength, then I ask you to share it. Like this video so that others may find it. Subscribe for more stories of truth, betrayal, and endurance. And leave a comment because your story matters too, and I would be honored to hear it.